Okay, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay with me here because what I'm about to walk you through is something we haven't seen in American politics in a very, very long time. It's 11 o'clock at night in Washington, D.C. The Capitol dome is lit up against a dark January sky. And inside that building, something is happening that should terrify one man more than anything else could. Republican senators, his senators, the people who have defended him through impeachments, through indictments, through everything, they're huddled in back hallways. They're texting each other. They're making phone calls that don't show up on any official schedule. And they're not coordinating against Democrats. They're coordinating against him. Here's what you need to understand about what just happened. The President of the United States has been publicly, and I need to stress that word publicly, floating the idea of using American military force against Greenland. Stop. Let that land, Greenland, which is part of Denmark. Denmark, which is a founding member of NATO. NATO, which has as its core principle, Article 5, the promise that an attack on one member is an attack on all. So when Donald Trump suggests military action against Greenland, he's not talking about some abstract territorial acquisition. He's talking about potentially triggering a conflict with our own allies, the nations we've sworn to defend, the nations whose soldiers have fought and died alongside Americans for 75 years. And Senator Chris Murphy had to stand on the Senate floor and explain to the American public that we cannot invade Allied territory without consequences. The fact that this required explanation tells you everything about where we are right now. Now, here's where this gets genuinely stunning. Republican senators, and I'm talking about people who have voted with this president on virtually everything, people who have defended the indefensible over and over again, they started making phone calls. Quiet ones at first. The kind of coordination that doesn't make it onto C-SPAN. And what were they coordinating? A bipartisan war powers resolution, designed specifically to limit this president's ability to take unilateral military action. Let me say that again so it lands properly. Republicans joined with Democrats to constrain Donald Trump's war-making authority. That doesn't just happen. That takes something breaking inside the coalition. That takes senators looking at what's coming and deciding that institutional survival matters more than party loyalty. And the president's response? Oh, the president's response is instructive. If you're finding this valuable, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications because this story is about to get significantly more complicated, and you're going to want to know what happens next. When Donald Trump found out what was happening, when he learned that Susan Collins and other Republicans were voting for this resolution, reports indicate he called Senator Collins directly. He was not calm. He was not measured. He was, according to sources with direct knowledge of the call, profane. He was threatening. He was enraged. Because here's what you need to understand about how this president processes power. He doesn't see it as delegated. He doesn't see it as constitutional. He sees it as personal, his, belonging to him. And when members of his own party tell him no, that doesn't register as democracy functioning. It registers as betrayal, as treachery, as something that must be punished. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that we've seen versions of this before. Presidents clash with Congress. That's the system working. That's supposed to happen. But there's a specific kind of moment, and we've only seen it a handful of times in American history, when members of a president's own party decide that loyalty to the institution has to outweigh loyalty to the man. Think about what that means. Richard Nixon didn't resign because Democrats turned on him. He resigned because Republicans Barry Goldwater, Hugh Scott, John Rhodes walked into the Oval Office and told him it was over, his own people, the ones who had defended him through everything. And that pattern, that moment when the internal guardrails activate, that is what appears to be happening right now. Stay with me here because I need to show you how all these pieces connect. So what does a president do when he feels his authority slipping? This is the part where you need to pay very close attention. He declares emergencies. Now, we've seen this before. Presidents have emergency powers. They're supposed to be used for actual emergencies, genuine threats to national security. But this president has discovered something dangerous. Emergency declarations don't just unlock policy tools, they unlock political weapons. Because once you declare an emergency, the rules change. Congress matters less. Debate matters less. Opposition becomes obstruction. Dissent becomes sabotage. And right on cue, we get a new national emergency declaration. This one tied to Venezuelan oil assets, framed as critical to American energy security. Now, let me tell you what this actually is, because the underlying reality, and this is documented, this is in the policy papers, is that any benefit from Venezuelan oil resources would take years to materialize. We're talking about massive infrastructure requirements, uncertain production timelines, and the primary beneficiaries, not American consumers, not working families paying too much at the gas pump. The beneficiaries would be multinational energy corporations, but that's not how emergencies work politically, is it? Emergencies aren't about timelines or feasibility. They're about narrative. They're about control. They're about shifting attention. And when you're a president facing internal revolt over war powers and congressional scrutiny over transparency failures and growing questions about why promised disclosures never seem to arrive, well, an emergency is awfully convenient. Here's where it gets genuinely concerning. While everyone's focused on the war powers fight, there's another story building underneath. It doesn't get the same cable news coverage. It's procedural, it's bureaucratic, it's exactly the kind of thing most people skip over, but it might be the most important part. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and this is on the record, has been publicly raising questions about Inspector General compliance, about statutory deadlines being missed, about document releases that were promised with great fanfare and then simply didn't happen. Now, he's not making accusations. I want to be clear about that. He's identifying process failures, red flags, the kind of things that in a normal administration would trigger automatic reviews. And here's why that matters. Inspectors general don't operate in the political theater. They deal in memos, in records, in chains of custody, in decision-making trails. Their work doesn't disappear when the news cycle moves on. And for a president whose entire strategy depends on controlling the narrative, on flooding the zone, on keeping every controversy competing for oxygen, the slow, methodical work of oversight is a threat like no other. If you're learning something from this breakdown, hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to show you next is where all of these threads come together. So let's map this out, because the connections matter. You have Republican senators breaking with the president on war powers, a direct challenge to his authority. You have emergency declarations being used to reframe the political landscape and centralize power. You have promised transparency initiatives that have stalled without explanation, raising questions about what's being hidden and why. And you have a president who responds to every check on his power, not with negotiation, not with accommodation, but with rage, with threats, with escalation. These aren't separate stories. They're the same story from different angles. A presidency trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. And here's what Republicans in Congress are wrestling with right now. They know, and some of them have said this privately to reporters on Background, they know that precedent outlives presidencies. Think about what that means. If they allow this president to normalize unilateral military threats against allies, the next president inherits that power. If they allow emergency declarations to become routine political tools, the next president inherits that playbook. If they allow oversight to fail, if they let statutory deadlines pass without consequence, if they accept that document releases can be promised and never delivered, they are building the architecture of their own irrelevance. And some of them have decided they're not willing to do that anymore. Now, I don't want to overstate this. This is not a mass exodus. This is not the entire Republican Party suddenly discovering constitutional principles, but it is something. It is movement. And it's coming from senators who understand that once a president openly suggests he is governed only by his own judgment, not by law, not by treaties, not by constitutional constraints, the question stops being partisan. It becomes structural. Are we still a republic? Or are we something else? And here's the thing about structural questions. They don't resolve themselves neatly. They don't wrap up in one news cycle. They persist. Because what we're watching isn't just a clash of personalities. It's not entertainment. It's not just the latest episode of political theater. This is a stress test of whether American institutions still function when the pressure comes from the top. And the answer isn't predetermined. It depends on choices. Real choices made by real people who have to decide whether the short-term cost of resistance is worth the long-term preservation of the system. Let me tell you what I'm watching for. I'm watching for whether the war powers resolution actually constrains anything or whether it becomes another ignored guardrail. I'm watching for whether the Inspector General investigations proceed with independence or whether they get slow-walked, defunded, or staffed with loyalists. I'm watching for whether the Republicans who voted for restraint face primary challenges and whether that threat forces them back into line. And I'm watching for whether the president escalates further, whether the emergency rhetoric expands, whether new crises get manufactured, whether the zone gets flooded so thoroughly that nobody can track anything anymore. Because here's the end game, and this is what Republicans are quietly confronting. A leader who treats every institutional limit as a personal insult does not moderate over time. They don't learn restraint. They don't grow into the job. They escalate, they accelerate, they demand loyalty tests, and they frame every check on their power as an attack on the nation itself, because in their mind, they are the nation. And that belief that the president and the country are synonymous is the thing that finally pushed members of his own party into open resistance. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough to matter, enough to pass a war powers resolution, enough to ask uncomfortable questions about oversight, enough to create distance where there used to be submission. And that distance, however small, is significant because it means the internal guardrails haven't completely collapsed. It means there are still people inside the system willing to say no. What happens next depends on something that's genuinely uncertain. It depends on whether saying no carries a price these lawmakers are willing to pay, because the president has made clear that resistance will be punished. Primary challenges, funding cuts, public humiliation, the full weight of the MAGA movement brought to bear against anyone who breaks ranks. And that threat has worked before. It's kept people in line for years. It's why so many concerns have been expressed privately rather than publicly. It's why anonymous quotes outnumber named sources 10 to 1. But something has shifted. Maybe it's the war rhetoric. Maybe it's the emergency declarations. Maybe it's the cumulative weight of promises made and not kept, of transparency pledged and not delivered, of norms violated so routinely that violation became the norm. Whatever the trigger, Republicans are calculating differently now. They're weighing institutional damage against party loyalty. And some of them, not enough maybe, but some are concluding that the institution has to win. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this is reaching, because what happens next affects all of us. Now I want to be clear about something. This is not a story about heroes. These are not profiles in courage. Many of these same lawmakers voted for things they knew were wrong. They looked away when they should have spoken up. They enabled precisely the behavior they're now trying to constrain. But, and this matters, systems don't require heroes. They require friction. They require enough resistance from enough places that power can't flow unchecked. And right now, friction is emerging. Not because people had moral epiphanies, but because they did the math and got scared. That's not inspiring. But it might be enough. So where does this end? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's not how these things work. What I know is that presidents who feel cornered don't become careful. They become dangerous. The rhetoric heats up, the crises multiply, the demands for loyalty become more extreme, and every escalation creates a new choice point for lawmakers, for institutions, for the public. Do you accommodate? Do you resist? Do you wait and hope it passes? Because here's what history teaches us. Systems don't fail all at once. They erode. They get challenged and tested and normalized until someone finally holds the line. And the question right now, the only question that matters, is whether enough people are willing to hold it. Now, before I leave you with my final thoughts, I want to put this moment in a broader context, because what we're witnessing didn't happen overnight, and it won't resolve overnight either. For years, political observers have asked the same question: what would it take? What would finally be the thing that made Republicans in Congress say enough? We've watched them defend tweets that would have ended any other political career. We've watched them rationalize behavior that violated every norm they once claimed to cherish. We've watched them vote to acquit twice when the evidence was overwhelming. And every time, the answer seemed to be the same: nothing. Nothing would be enough. Party loyalty had become so absolute that the very concept of institutional limits had been abandoned. But here's what I think those observers, myself included at times, may have underestimated: self-preservation, not moral awakening, not sudden constitutional devotion, self-preservation. Because when a president starts talking about using military force against NATO allies, when he starts governing through emergency declarations that bypass Congress entirely, when he makes clear that his authority recognizes no institutional boundaries whatsoever, even the most loyal senators start doing a different kind of math. They start thinking about what happens when they're not useful anymore. They start thinking about what a president with unlimited power does to people who were once allies but become obstacles. They start thinking about their own futures in a system where the rules only apply to some people. And that calculation, as cynical as it sounds, might be what saves us, because the founders didn't design the Constitution expecting virtue. They designed it expecting ambition to counteract ambition. They built in friction precisely because they knew that power concentrated in one place, in one person, would eventually consume everything around it. What we're seeing right now is that friction finally engaging, not because senators had a change of heart, but because they finally realized that a president who accepts no limits is a threat to everyone, including the people who helped him get there. And there's something else worth understanding about this moment. The international community is watching. Our allies are watching. The nations who have relied on American leadership, on American stability, on the basic predictability of American foreign policy, they are watching Republican senators decide whether the United States still operates under the rule of law. Because here's the thing about alliances, they're not just military agreements, they're trust agreements. They're built on the assumption that the United States will honor its commitments, that treaties will be respected, that the world's most powerful military won't be turned against the nations it swore to protect. When a president suggests otherwise, even rhetorically, that trust erodes. And when members of his own party have to pass legislation to prevent him from acting on those suggestions, the whole world sees how close we came. That damage doesn't disappear when the news cycle moves on. It lingers in diplomatic cables. It factors into defense planning in capitals around the world. It shapes how other nations calculate their relationship with America for years, potentially decades to come. So, what we're watching isn't just a domestic political story. It's a story about whether American leadership can be trusted, whether our word means anything, whether the institutions that have underpinned global stability for 75 years still function. And the answer to that question is being written right now in the votes of Republican senators who are finally deciding that some lines cannot be crossed. Let me leave you with three things. First, what we witnessed this week is historically significant. Republican senators breaking with their own president on war powers is rare. The last time we saw anything comparable, it preceded a president's resignation. Second, the pattern of emergency declarations, transparency failures, and rage at institutional constraints is accelerating. Each piece reinforces the others, and without sustained resistance, the trajectory only goes one direction. Third, the next few weeks will determine whether this moment of Republican resistance holds or collapses under pressure. Watch for primary threats. Watch for retaliatory rhetoric. Watch for whether the senators who voted for restraint maintain their position or quietly fall back in line. This is what we're watching unfold, not a television drama, not content for your feed. An actual test of whether American democracy can constrain a president who doesn't accept constraints. The Republicans breaking ranks aren't doing it for applause. They're doing it because they finally understand something that should have been obvious years ago. That power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and defended through intimidation, eventually turns against everything it touches, including them. And so here we are, late at night in Washington, phones lighting up, senators reading messages twice, a president furious at his own party, and somewhere in that building, decisions are being made that will shape not just this presidency, but every presidency that follows, because precedent is real, it lasts. And what gets established now, what gets allowed now, becomes the template for whatever comes next. That's the stakes. That's what this is about. Not Trump, not Republicans, not Democrats. Whether power still has limits, whether institutions still function, whether the system can hold. The answer is being written right now in votes and subpoenas and oversight requests and uncomfortable conversations. Democracy doesn't defend itself. It depends on people who understand that their duty to the Constitution outweighs their duty to any individual, no matter how powerful. And tonight, for the first time in a very long time, we saw signs that some of those people still exist. Whether they hold the line in the days ahead will determine everything. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because this story is far from finished. I'll be covering every development as it happens. The world is watching to see which way it goes. I'll be watching, and so should you.